Greetings, quiet chroniclers. Tonight we don our bloodstained aprons to explore the grim and, frankly, hilarious world of the Crusader surgeon. Forget heroics, picture battlefield triage with no painkillers, tools resembling torture devices, and a firm belief in treatments that were essentially slow-motion death sentences. Being a surgeon, then, it sucked so badly you might actually start looking forward to your next dental appointment. If this trip into medical misery tickles your funny bone, give us a like and subscribe. Now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from as we begin this delightful horror. In the grimy theater of medieval medicine, the physician sat at the top. This university graduate studied ancient Greek texts, often without checking if their 2,000-year-old advice worked. He was a scholar who could diagnose you from across the room by inspecting a flask of your urine, a practice known as uroscopy. He wouldn't dream of touching you, of course. Physical contact was for the lower classes. His job was to ponder cosmic imbalances, blame your raging fever on a planetary misalignment or an excess of black bile, and look terribly important while doing so. So what did this esteemed physician prescribe for a gaping wound? Not surgery. That was messy. He might recommend a broth of boiled herbs and some light bloodletting, to be performed by someone else, naturally. His world was one of charts, theories, and pompous Latin. He was less a doctor and more a walking, talking medical encyclopedia that was centuries out of date and missing the chapter on basic hygiene. His primary skill was to sound convincing while being spectacularly wrong, ensuring he was well paid and well away from any actual blood. And who was that someone else? Ah, our protagonist, the surgeon. Socially, the surgeon was several rungs below the physician, often lumped in with tradesmen like butchers. Many were barber-surgeons, meaning the same fellow who gave you a shave was also your go-to guy for lancing a boil, pulling a tooth, or sawing off a limb. There was no prestigious university for these men. Their education was an apprenticeship, learning the trade by watching, doing, and presumably making a great many fatal mistakes along the way. The Crusader surgeon's toolkit looked like it was stolen from a torture chamber. It was a terrifying assortment of unsterilized iron, heavy-duty saws, arrow extractors that resembled corkscrews from hell, and cauterizing irons. These red-hot pokers weren't used to sterilize the wound. They had no concept of germs, but to burn the flesh shut to stop bleeding. It was brutally effective and agonizingly painful, often causing more damage and ensuring a spectacular infection later on. While the physician pondered books, the surgeon sharpened his blades. Now, let's place this dysfunctional duo on a Crusader battlefield. A knight takes a crossbow bolt to the thigh. The physician is summoned. He might stroke his beard, glance at the sky, and declare the wound cold and wet, requiring a hot and dry remedy, like a plaster of pigeon droppings before leaving. It was the surgeon who had to get in there, ignore the screams, and attempt to dig out the mangled arrowhead, knowing his every touch was likely introducing a fresh world of filth into the wound. This was the surgeon's grim reality. While knights chased eternal glory, the surgeon chased infection. He confronted the direct, ugly consequences of combat. He wasn't dealing with heroic charges. He was dealing with gangrene, shattered bones, and the stench of death that clung to his hands and clothes. His work was not glorious. It was a desperate, messy, and often futile struggle against the sepsis that followed almost every serious injury. His reward wasn't a place in heaven, but simply surviving another day without being blamed for the death of a wealthy patron. So who had the bigger headache, the scholar or the slicer? It's not a contest. The physician's biggest worry was being proven a fraud. The surgeon's headache was constant and visceral. It was the headache of sawing through bone, of watching a patient die from shock, of knowing that even his most successful amputation would likely result in a slow, feverish death from infection a week later. The physician dealt in theories. The surgeon dealt in a near 100% mortality rate for injuries we consider minor today. Ultimately, the physician held all the prestige, basking in unearned authority, while the surgeon toiled in the bloody, thankless trenches of practical medicine. He was the medieval world's most overworked tradesman, a man whose job required the nerves of a soldier and the stomach of a vulture, all for the social standing of a barber. The physician's predicament was protecting his reputation. The surgeon's predicament was trying to put people back together with a knife, a prayer, and the sinking feeling he was only making things worse. To understand why being a Crusader surgeon was such a uniquely dreadful occupation, we must first submerge ourselves in the murky, fever dream logic of medieval medical theory. You must forget everything you know about germs, viruses, and cellular biology. For centuries, the health of every king, knight, and peasant was governed by a single, all-encompassing, and catastrophically incorrect idea, the theory of the four humors. This wasn't some fringe belief, it was the unquestioned scientific dogma of the age. the fundamental operating system for the human body, inherited from the ancient Greeks and Romans. The core concept was deceptively simple. Your body contained 4 essential fluids, or humors. As long as these 4 liquids sloshed around in perfect harmonious balance, you remained in a state of perfect health. The moment one of them became too abundant or a bit deficient, congratulations, you were officially sick. First in this vital quartet was blood, the humor of the sanguine. Associated with the element of air and the vibrant energy of spring, blood was believed to make you cheerful, optimistic, and sociable. A person with a healthy amount of blood was the life of any gathering, but a person with too much blood? According to physicians, they were feverish, manic, and dangerously overenthusiastic. In this world, your happiness could literally be diagnosed as a disease requiring immediate treatment. Next in the lineup was phlegm, the humor of the phlegmatic. Intrinsically tied to the element of water and the cold dampness of winter, phlegm was held responsible for a calm, quiet, and perhaps slightly sluggish temperament. An excess of phlegm became the go-to explanation for a vast array of conditions, from a common cold and persistent cough to chronic apathy and general laziness. If you were feeling unmotivated, your physician would nod sagely, a classic case of your internal dampness getting the better of you. Then we have the fiery one, yellow bile, the humor of the choleric. Connected to the element of fire and the oppressive heat of summer, this humor dictated your ambition, energy, and passion. In excess, however, it transformed you into a choleric nightmare, an angry, irritable, and aggressive individual. Any bad-tempered nobleman prone to shouting, throwing goblets, and generally terrorizing his staff was simply diagnosed with an overabundance of yellow bile. It was the perfect medical excuse for being an insufferable jerk. And finally, we arrive at the most famous of the bunch, black bile, the humor of the melancholy. Linked to the element of earth and the decay of autumn, this humor in balance was thought to provide a thoughtful, introspective, and serious nature. But when it ran amok, it produced a deep and profound sadness, a crippling depression that they called melancholy. It is the direct origin of our modern word, a testament to how deeply this flawed theory permeated the very language of Western thought for centuries. These 4 elemental fluids were believed to be in a constant, delicate dance within every single person. Your unique personality, your physical appearance, your moods, and your general state of health were all dictated by your inborn humoral balance. The perfect equilibrium was the ultimate, albeit near impossible, ideal. This constant potential for imbalance ensured that physicians had a permanent and highly profitable source of business, diagnosing the subtle shifts in their patients' internal tides. Virtually anything could upset this precarious internal balance. Eating the wrong foods, getting caught in a chilly evening wind, experiencing a great shock, or even just thinking a particularly sad thought could cause one of the humors to surge dangerously. This internal chaos, this humoral imbalance, was the universal diagnosis for every ailment imaginable, from a minor headache or a splinter in your finger to the full-blown horror of the plague. So, how did a medieval physician, when faced with a coughing, feverish patient, determine which of these vital fluids had gone rogue? The process was a masterful performance, a blend of keen observation, folk wisdom, rampant superstition, and what can only be described as supremely confident guesswork. The first step was always to look, to listen, and to ponder the vast array of non-physical influences on the patient's sorry state. The physician would carefully consider the patient's temperament, the time of year, the prevailing weather, and the color of their skin, but these were mere appetizers for the main course of medieval diagnostics, a field of study so important and so profoundly bizarre that it became the physician's signature skill. We are speaking, of course, of the ancient and noble art of staring intently at a flask of pee. This practice was known as uroscopy, and it was the absolute pinnacle of non-invasive medical sophistication. A respected physician, sometimes called a piss prophet, would hold a specially shaped glass flask of the patient's urine up to the light, inspecting its contents with the intense gravity of a master jeweler examining a priceless diamond. They weren't looking for signs of infection or kidney failure in the modern sense. They were looking for signs of the universe. To aid in this endeavor, they would consult a urine wheel. This was a wonderfully complex and often beautifully illustrated circular chart that linked up to 20 different aspects of urine: its color, its consistency, its sediment, and even its smell and taste. To a specific humoral imbalance, was the urine reddish, an excess of blood, clearly? Was it pale and thin? A dangerous surplus of a particularly foul smell might indicate that the humors were literally putrefying inside your body. If staring at bodily fluids wasn't providing a clear answer, it was time to consult an even higher authority, the heavens themselves. Medical astrology was a core and mandatory component of any respectable physician's education. The guiding belief was that the macrocosm of the stars and planets, was directly reflected in the microcosm of the human body. Every organ and body part was ruled by a planet or a zodiac sign. This cosmic connection was famously depicted in illustrations of the Zodiac Man, which showed a human figure with each part of his body linked to a different astrological sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on, all the way down to Pisces governing the feet. This wasn't just a fun curiosity, it was a critical and unchangeable law of medicine, and ignoring it was to risk cosmic and fatal consequences. The position of the stars was therefore of critical importance for both diagnosis and treatment. One simply did not, under any circumstances, perform a bleeding from the arm if the moon was in Gemini. That would be an act of profound cosmic malpractice. A competent physician had to also be a competent astronomer, carefully calculating the positions of the celestial bodies before daring to prescribe a cure, ensuring the entire universe was on their side first. But what if the urine was clear, the stars were unhelpful, and the patient's pulse was ambiguous? There was always one final, unassailable diagnosis that could explain any mysterious illness, especially the grievous wounds sustained on a crusading battlefield: divine will. More often than not, sickness and injury were seen not as a matter of biology, but of theology. They were a direct punishment from God for one's sins. This was a particularly difficult diagnosis for a patient to receive. It meant that their intense suffering was not a random misfortune of war or a matter of bad luck, but a deserved penance for some moral or spiritual failing. The resulting prescription, therefore, had nothing at all to do with medicine and everything to do with theology. The cure wasn't a potion that could be mixed, but a prayer that had to be recited with sincere penitence. For a long-suffering Crusader surgeon, this was a maddening and professionally insulting dead end. He was a practical man of blades and bandages, there to fix a physical body that had been broken. Yet he was constantly trapped in a system where that body was merely a vessel for grand spiritual and cosmic dramas that were far beyond his control, and certainly beyond the reach of his bloodstained saw. Once a diagnosis was finally made, be it an excess of bile, a planetary misalignment, or a divine smiting, it was time for treatment. The goal of every medieval cure was to restore the body's natural humoral balance. The methods they used to achieve this noble goal were, without exception, brutal, misguided, invasive, and often far more dangerous than the original ailment they were meant to be treating. The guiding principle was one of aggressive expulsion. If your body has too much of something, you simply have to get it out. This rather crude philosophy led to the two great pillars of medieval therapeutic practice: bleeding and purging. These were not treatments of last resort. For hundreds of years, they were the undisputed gold standard of medical care, applied liberally for almost any complaint. Let's begin with the undisputed star of the show, phlebotomy, or bloodletting. Believed to cure everything from a raging fever to a foul mood, it was the Swiss Army knife in the physician's theoretical toolkit. The most common method was venesection, where a surgeon or a barber would make a clean incision in a vein, typically in the crook of the arm, and drain a prescribed amount of blood into a bowl, thereby reducing the body's excess of the sanguine humor. How much blood was to be let? That depended on a complex calculation involving the patient's age, their complexion, the season, the weather, and of course, the current position of the moon. If cutting wasn't to your liking, you could opt for leeches, which were applied to the skin to suck out the bad blood. Feeling faint and lightheaded during the procedure was seen as an excellent sign. It meant the cure was working and you were just moments away from a perfect humoral balance, or at least from blissful unconsciousness. If the problem wasn't your blood, but one of the other humors, the physician would turn to purging. This was a full-scale, a two-pronged assault on the digestive system. To deal with excess yellow or black bile, a patient would be given powerful laxatives and cathartics, substances designed to induce a violent and prolonged bout of diarrhea. The goal was to physically cleanse the body of the offending humor from the bottom up, along with any lingering sense of personal dignity. Not every treatment was quite so dramatic. Herbal remedies and dietary changes were a cornerstone of humoral management, often governed by the doctrine of signatures. This delightful theory proposed that God had helpfully marked plants to indicate their use. A plant with a liver-shaped leaf, like liverwort, was obviously for liver ailments. Walnuts looked like little brains, so naturally they were prescribed for headaches. It was a simple, if entirely imaginary, system of divine labeling. Now place our Crusader surgeon at the end of this theoretical nightmare. He finally receives a knight with a grievous wound. But before he can even properly assess the damage, the poor man has already been bled to the point of fainting to reduce his sanguine fever, purged with powerful laxatives to clear out his choleric anger, and had a poultice of astrologically approved brain-shaped nuts applied to his head. The surgeon's job wasn't just to fix the injury, it was to attempt his brutal craft on a body that had already been systematically weakened by the very medical theory that was supposed to save it. To truly appreciate the misery of the Crusader surgeon, we must move on from the wonderfully imaginative, yet entirely fictitious, world of humoral theory. We now turn our attention from the why of medieval medicine to the horrifying how. This is the chapter where abstract theory meets suffering flesh, where prayers and planetary alignments give way to the stark, cold reality of iron on bone. So let us settle in and join our beleaguered surgeon as he prepares for his work. Imagine the scene. A wounded soldier, his leg shattered by a mace or pierced by an arrow, is brought before you. There is no sterile white operating theater, no gentle anesthetic gas. The procedure will take place in a smoky, torchlit tent, a drafty castle chamber, or perhaps right there on the blood-soaked ground where the man fell. You unroll your toolkit, not with the delicate care of a modern doctor, but with the grim practicality of a butcher laying out his cleavers and knives for the day's grim work. The instruments themselves were forged from iron, or occasionally bronze. They were heavy, clumsy, and utilitarian, prone to the patient and silent killer that was rust. The very concept of stainless steel, of a material that could resist corrosion and be properly cleaned, was centuries in the future. Every microscopic nick, every dark fleck of rust on a blade was a tiny, thriving metropolis of bacteria, eagerly awaiting its chance to be introduced directly into a patient's body. The philosophy guiding the use of these dreadful tools was brutally simple and had three main tenets. First and most important was speed. With no effective anesthesia, any procedure had to be performed as quickly as humanly possible to minimize the duration of the agony. Second was brute force. Forget precision and finesse, the goal was simply to get the job done. And third was a healthy dose of hope and prayer, because both surgeon and patient knew that survival was often completely out of their hands. Let us first examine the undisputed king of the surgical toolkit, the instrument of last resort, the amputation saw. Do not picture the sleek, sterilized, fine-toothed instrument of modern surgery. You must picture a carpenter's saw, or perhaps a butcher's saw, borrowed for the occasion. It was heavy, with a thick, unwieldy blade and large, rough teeth designed for ripping through wood or bone with maximum efficiency and minimum subtlety. The handle was often simple wood, worn smooth with the sweat and grime of years of use, stained with the dark, faded memory of countless prior operations. It was a tool of pure, raw function. Holding it, the surgeon was not so much a healer as he was a human lumberjack, preparing to fell a diseased limb from the trunk of a living body. The sheer physical strength required to saw through a human femur was immense. The purpose of an amputation, you must understand, was not to meticulously save as much of the limb as possible. The purpose was to get a gangrenous or hopelessly shattered limb off the body before the patient died of shock, blood loss, or the rapid spread of the foulness within. It was a desperate race against time, measured in the ragged, agonizing back-and-forth strokes of the blade. A typical leg amputation could take several agonizing minutes, an eternity for the conscious patient. For smaller jobs, the surgeon turned to his scalpels and knives. Again, we must adjust our mental image away from the modern world. These were not the featherlight, single-use, gamma-sterilized scalpels of today. A medieval scalpel was, in essence, a simple knife, often with a fixed iron blade and a handle made of bone, wood, or horn. It would be sharpened on a common whetstone, just like any other utility blade. In fact, these surgical knives were often indistinguishable from the knives a man might carry for eating his food or cutting a length of rope. Their edges were frequently dull, nicked, and of course teeming with an invisible world of microscopic life. The idea of using a blade once and then discarding it would have been considered laughably wasteful. A good knife was a companion for life, a silent carrier of microscopic histories from every patient it had ever touched. Therefore, a surgical incision was not the clean, bloodless line we see in medical dramas on television. It was a jagged, painful tearing of the skin and the muscle beneath. A dull blade required the surgeon to apply more pressure, causing significantly more trauma to the surrounding tissue. The act was less a delicate surgical cut and more of a controlled, gruesome gouging, repeated until a sufficient opening had been carved into the patient's body. And what about injuries to the head, that most sacred and delicate part of the body? For this, the surgeon possessed a special set of tools that represent a unique and particularly terrifying branch of medieval surgery, the trepanning instruments. If a knight suffered a skull fracture from a blow, it was believed that drilling a hole in his head would relieve the dangerous pressure on the brain, or perhaps allow the evil spirits that had entered the wound to escape. The primary tool for this ghastly procedure was a hand-cranked drill, often a brace and bit design that would be familiar to any woodworker of the period. The surgeon would place the sharp point of the bit against the patient's skull and begin to turn, slowly, carefully, boring a hole through the solid bone while the patient was held down, wide awake and fully horribly aware of the gruesome carpentry being performed on their own head. Once an incision was made or a limb was removed, the surgeon often had to go digging. For this, he turned to his forceps and pliers. These were heavy, clumsy instruments more at home in a blacksmith's forge than a medical tent. They were designed for gripping and pulling with tremendous force. Their primary use on the battlefield was the extraction of foreign objects, arrowheads, splinters of wood from a lance, or fragments of shattered bone. Imagine the surgeon probing a deep wound with these heavy iron pliers, blindly fishing around for the barbed head of an arrow buried deep in a man's thigh. The instrument, unsterilized and rough, would crush and tear at the delicate muscle and tissue as it searched. The concept of finesse was entirely absent. This was a desperate, violent search and rescue mission performed in a cavern of living flesh. Let's now turn to the single most important and perhaps most feared tool in the entire surgical bag, the cautery iron. This was the surgeon's primary method for dealing with the greatest immediate threat in any surgery, uncontrolled bleeding. A cautery iron was a deceptively simple device, an iron rod sometimes with a specially shaped tip that was heated in a nearby fire or brazier until it glowed a terrifying bright red. Once an amputation was complete, the surgeon or his assistant would take the searing hot iron and press it directly onto the open, bleeding stump of the wound. The purpose of this horrifying act was not sterilization. They had no knowledge of germs. It was hemostasis. The intense heat would burn the blood vessels shut, searing the flesh and stopping the bleeding. It was brutally effective and unimaginably painful. The sound of a cauterization was a sharp, angry sizzle, like water thrown onto a hot skillet. It was immediately followed by the sickeningly sweet smell of burning human flesh, a smell that would cling to the surgeon's clothes and hair for days. The searing, incandescent pain of the cautery iron would often eclipse the initial pain of the wound, or the amputation itself, sometimes causing the patient to faint or die from shock on the spot. If a wound was to be closed, the surgeon would turn to his needles and sutures. These were not the fine, sterile instruments we know today. A surgical needle was a thick, often triangular-pointed piece of iron or bronze, which could be clumsy and difficult to pass through the skin. It was much like a needle used for sewing leather or canvas, and it would be used over and over again. The thread itself was equally crude. Sutures were often made from animal sinew, strands of silk, or even horsehair, none of which were sterilized before use. So as the surgeon laboriously stitched a wound closed, he was sewing a foreign, bacteria-laden material directly into the flesh, creating a perfect lattice upon which a new and deadly infection could grow and flourish. Now we must discuss the most important instruments in the surgeon's bag, the ones that were missing. The first and most conspicuous absence was any form of effective anesthesia. The raw, unfiltered, and overwhelming agony of surgery was not a side effect, it was an integral part of the experience. Pain was something to be endured, a trial to be overcome by the patient's own fortitude. Pain management, such as it was primitive in the extreme. The patient might be given a large quantity of wine or ale to dull the senses, though this was often ineffective against the sheer trauma of the procedures. They might be given a wooden stick or a leather strap to bite down upon to prevent them from screaming and shattering their own teeth. Most importantly, they were physically restrained by several strong assistants. The final missing piece of the puzzle, the one that explains why Crusader surgery was so often a death sentence, was the complete and utter lack of Antiseptics. The very idea that invisible creatures could cause infection was a fantasy that would not become medical fact for another 600 years. A surgeon's understanding of cleanliness was based on what he could see. If a blade looked clean, it was clean. A surgeon would feel no hesitation in wiping a bloody scalpel on his own filthy apron before using it again. He would probe a deep, gaping wound with his unwashed fingers to locate an arrowhead. He would use the same saw on a gangrenous leg, and then minutes later, on a relatively clean wound, transferring filth from one patient to the next. He was not a monster. He was simply a man of his time, a man utterly ignorant of the microscopic death he wielded. And so, every cut, every stitch, every probe was an invitation. The surgeon's tools, meant to save a life, were the perfect delivery system for infection. They bypassed the body's natural defenses, pushing bacteria deep into the warm, welcoming environment of the wound. Our Crusader surgeon, for all his experience and good intentions, wasn't just a surgeon. He was, unknowingly, a master cultivator of sepsis, gangrene, and death. We have journeyed through the phantom logic of the four humors and stared into the terrifying abyss of the surgeon's toolkit. Now, we must confront the single most defining aspect of medieval surgery, the great, silent elephant in every operating tent and castle chamber. We must talk about pain, or rather, we must talk about the profound and total absence of any meaningful way to stop it. Before we proceed, take a moment to appreciate the quiet miracle of modern anesthesia. The gentle drift into unconsciousness, the complete oblivion to the procedure, the calm awakening in a recovery room. It is a gift of science we take so for granted. Now, take that gift and throw it away. For the Crusader and his surgeon, such a peaceful experience was not only unavailable, it was entirely unimaginable. The simple, brutal truth is that the chemical knowledge required to produce effective, reliable anesthesia was still many centuries in the future. There was no nitrous oxide, no ether, no carefully calibrated intravenous drip. The surgeon's battle was fought on two fronts, one against the injury itself, and the other against the raw, overwhelming, and unfiltered agony of his own patient. Pain was not a side effect of surgery. It was the very medium in which surgery took place. Furthermore, the medieval philosophy of pain was complex. To the deeply pious mind, suffering was not always something to be avoided. It could be seen as a trial from God, a penance for one's sins that purified the soul. It could even be interpreted as a positive sign, a fiery manifestation of the body's vitality as it fought against affliction. To endure great pain with fortitude was a mark of virtue and strength. A nice thought, perhaps, but likely of little comfort when the saw started to cut. This is not to say that they had nothing at all. The Crusader surgeon did have a small, unreliable, and deeply dangerous arsenal of substances aimed at pain management. The first and most common of these was, of course, alcohol. A large flagon of strong wine or a tankard of thick, murky ale was the standard preoperative prescription for the patient, and sometimes, one imagines, for the surgeon himself. Alcohol was plentiful, relatively cheap, and its effects were well known. A sufficiently drunk patient might be marginally more relaxed, a little slower to react, and perhaps slightly duller to the initial shock of the blade. It was, without question, better than nothing, but being drunk is a very, very long way from being anesthetized. No amount of wine can truly silence the searing protest of a nerve being severed. In fact, alcohol could often make the surgeon's job even harder. A drunk patient is not necessarily a compliant patient. They could become belligerent, emotional, or simply unpredictable, thrashing about with inebriated strength. The surgeon was then faced with the unenviable task of performing a delicate procedure on a struggling patient who was both in agony and extremely intoxicated. For truly desperate cases, the surgeon might turn to his pharmacopoeia of more potent and far more dangerous herbal concoctions. This was the heavy artillery of medieval sedation, a witch's brew of powerful narcotics and poisons. The key ingredients were plants whose names still carry a whisper of danger: the opium poppy, mandrake root, henbane, and sometimes even hemlock. These plants contained powerful alkaloids that could indeed induce a state of deep sedation or unconsciousness. Opium in particular was known for its potent pain-dulling effects. A draught containing a sufficient quantity of these substances could, in theory, render a patient insensible to the surgeon's work. This sounds like a solution, but it was a solution wrapped in a deadly gamble. The problem was the dose. There were no standardized potencies, no clinical trials, no understanding of how these alkaloids affected the central nervous system. The line between a dose that caused sedation and a dose that caused fatal respiratory depression was razor thin, and crossing it was a matter of pure, terrifying guesswork. Every time a surgeon administered such a potion, he was rolling the dice. This deadly gamble is perfectly encapsulated in an almost mythical tool known as the soporific sponge. In theory, a sea sponge would be soaked in a potent mixture of opium, mandrake, henbane, and other sedatives, and then dried. When it was time for surgery, the sponge would be moistened and held firmly over the patient's mouth and nose, forcing them to inhale the narcotic fumes. The idea was that the patient would drift off into a deep surgical sleep. Medical and historical texts from the period described this practice, painting a picture of a surprisingly sophisticated, if primitive, form of inhalational anesthesia. It was for a long time believed to be the great secret of medieval pain control, allowing surgeons to perform complex procedures on blissfully unaware patients. However, modern historical and scientific analysis has cast serious doubt on the effectiveness of this soporific sponge. Many scholars now believe its effects were minimal at best. The amount of active narcotic that could be delivered by such a method was likely far too low to induce true surgical anesthesia. The sponge may have been more of a ritual, a piece of medical theater designed to calm the patient and give them a focal point before the real work and the real pain began. Ultimately, chemical assistance was a double-edged sword. The surgeon was forced to choose between two terrible options: operate on a patient who was screaming, conscious, and struggling, or operate on a quiet patient who might, at any moment, stop breathing forever. Faced with this choice, most surgeons preferred the screaming. A screaming patient, after all, was unquestionably a living patient. With chemical options being so unreliable and dangerous, the primary and most dependable method of pain management was purely physical. The true anesthetic of the medieval world was not a drug, but overwhelming brute force. Every surgeon relied on a team of strong, sober assistants, whose most important job was to be human clamps. When the time for surgery came, the patient would be laid out on a table, a bed, or the ground, and the assistants would take their positions, one man on each arm, one on each leg, perhaps another holding down the torso. Their job was to physically restrain the patient, to overpower their desperate, pain-fueled struggles, and to hold them as still as humanly possible while the surgeon worked his grim magic. This reality transformed surgery from a medical procedure into a violent physical struggle. It was a battle of wills and strength, pitting the patient's primal instinct to escape unbearable agony against the raw power of the surgeon's assistants. The surgeon himself had to operate within this chaotic, moving tableau, timing his cuts and stitches to the brief moments of exhaustion between the patient's frantic convulsions. To aid in this process, another simple but essential tool was employed: the bite stick. This was a simple piece of wood, or sometimes a thick roll of leather, that was thrust into the patient's mouth before the first cut was made. It served two vital purposes. First, it prevented the patient from biting off their own tongue or shattering their teeth in a spasm of agony. Second, it gave the patient a focal point for their suffering. It was something to physically latch onto, to pour all their strength and terror into. The sound of splintering wood creaking under the incredible pressure of a human jaw clenched in the ultimate extremity of pain would have been a common and dreadful sound in any surgical tent. Now, we must address the sound itself. We must talk about the holy scream. In a modern operating room, a cry of pain from a patient is a sign of failure, an emergency that must be addressed immediately. In the medieval era, the scream was the exact opposite. It was normal, it was expected, it was the constant, horrifying soundtrack to the work of healing. A silent patient was a cause for great alarm. Silence did not mean the patient was peaceful. It meant they had likely fainted from the pain, or worse, had died from shock or blood loss. The surgeon would often work to the rhythm of the patient's cries, the rising and falling screams providing a grim assurance that his subject was, against all odds, still clinging to life. Imagine the soundscape of that Crusader's tent, the terse, low commands of the surgeon, the grunts of exertion from the assistants as they wrestled with the patient, the wet, rhythmic rasp of the saw cutting through bone, and above it all, weaving through it all, the raw, piercing, and unrelenting screams of a human being enduring the unendurable. This was the music of medieval surgery. And so we return to the bleak options available to a wounded soldier facing the surgeon's knife. Your choices were, indeed, to get blackout drunk and hope for the best, to pray to God for a swift end to the ordeal, or a place in paradise, or to simply scream as loudly and as long as your lungs would allow. For most, the experience was likely a terrifying cocktail of all three. The scream was not just a sound of pain, it was a prayer, a plea, and a visceral, vital sign that you were, for one more agonizing moment, still alive. We have established that our Crusader surgeon was working within a framework of pure medical fantasy, using instruments of torture, and without the benefit of anesthesia. Now we must turn our gaze to the raw material he was forced to work with, the human body, brutalized and broken by the unique horrors of medieval combat. This was the surgeon's canvas, a landscape of trauma, quite different from the battlefields of the modern world. Forget the abstract, impersonal nature of modern warfare. The violence of a crusading battle was intimate. It was the crushing weight of a mace, the shearing force of a sword edge, the piercing impact of an arrow, all delivered up close and personal. Every wound was a testament to a moment of terrifying, violent contact. The surgeon's job was to deal with the gruesome aftermath of these countless personal apocalypses. Imagine the scene inside the surgeon's tent, a short distance from the fury of the battle. The air, thick with the smell of blood and fear, would be filled with a chorus of groans and screams. The men brought to the surgeon were not suffering from neat, isolated injuries. They were comprehensively mangled, the products of a storm of edged, blunt, and piercing trauma. They were, in essence, walking, bleeding monuments to the terrible physics of medieval weaponry. The challenge for the surgeon was therefore one of overwhelming complexity. He was not just a specialist in a single type of injury. He had to be prepared to deal with every conceivable form of bodily destruction, often all at once, on the same unfortunate patient. Your patient isn't just wounded. He's a human pincushion with internal bleeding, shattered bones, and a very bad attitude. Where do you even begin? Let us start with the most iconic of medieval injuries, the wounds delivered by edged weapons. The long, heavy broadsword was not a delicate fencing foil. It was a sharpened pry bar, designed to hack and cleave through mail, leather, and flesh. A well-aimed sword cut was not a clean slice. It was a deep, gaping chasm torn into the body, severing muscle, sinew, and arteries along its path. The most immediate and terrifying consequence of a major sword wound was blood loss. With a major artery in the arm or leg severed, a man could bleed to death in a matter of minutes. The surgeon's first desperate act was to try and staunch this flow, often by stuffing the wound with rags and moss, before turning to the horrifying finality of the cauterizing iron. The sheer volume of blood would have been staggering. Furthermore, a sword blade was never clean. It was an object that lived in a leather scabbard and was used to parry other dirty swords. It was coated in rust, grime, and the blood of previous victims. When it sliced into a new body, it carried all of that filth with it, depositing a rich culture of bacteria deep into the warm, inviting environment of the wound, guaranteeing that even if the patient survived the blood loss, a raging infection was already on its way. Even more devastating than the sword was the battle axe. With its weighted head and wedge-shaped blade, the axe was designed with a single principle in mind: splitting things apart. An axe blow to a limb or a torso did not just cut, it cleaved. It shattered bone, pulverized muscle, and left behind a wound of such catastrophic damage that amputation was often the only conceivable, if futile, option. The sheer momentum of a heavy axe could be devastating even against an armored opponent. While a coat of mail might stop the blade from cutting cleanly through, it could not stop the kinetic force. The result was a horrific combination of trauma: a deep, crushing bruise, broken ribs, and massive internal bleeding, all located directly beneath a mangled but perhaps unbroken layer of armor. This leads us to the unique horror of blunt force trauma, the specialty of weapons like the mace, the flail, and the warhammer. These instruments of percussion were designed with one goal: to defeat armor by simply crushing the man inside it. They did not need to cut the skin to be spectacularly lethal. They were masters of concealed internal devastation. A blow from a mace to the chest could shatter a man's ribs, driving the splintered ends into his lungs. A strike to the abdomen could rupture the spleen, liver, or kidneys, causing massive and unstoppable internal bleeding. A hammer blow to the head, even against a helmet, could cause a concussion so severe that the brain would swell, crushing itself against the inside of the skull. For the Crusader surgeon, these internal injuries were a diagnostic nightmare. With no x-rays, no CT scans, no way to see inside the body, he was working completely blind. He had to guess the extent of the internal damage based on crude external signs: the patient's shallow breathing, the bluish tint of their skin, the location of the bruising, and where they screamed the loudest when he prodded them with his unwashed fingers. Sometimes the force of a blunt weapon was so great that it created a compound fracture. This is where the bone not only breaks, but the sharp shattered ends are driven out through the skin, creating an open wound. The sight of a splintered yellowish piece of femur sticking out of a blood and dirt-caked thigh was a common sight for the battlefield surgeon. It was a formal, engraved invitation to gangrene and sepsis. An open fracture was one of the most feared injuries of the age. It combined the horror of a broken bone with the certainty of a deep, contaminated wound. The surgeon's task was to somehow clean the wound, push the bone back inside the body, and set the limb, all without painkillers and with the full knowledge that the patient's chances of survival were astronomically low. Now we must turn to the most ubiquitous of all battlefield injuries, the wound that filled the surgeon's tent more than any other: the puncture wound from an arrow. From a distance, an arrow wound might seem less dramatic than a gaping sword cut, but it presented a unique and wicked set of challenges that made it one of the most difficult injuries to treat. The problem with an arrow is that it flies through the air, collecting dust and dirt, passes through filthy clothing, and then buries all of that contaminated material deep within the body. The small entry wound would close up behind it, trapping the filth inside and creating a perfect, anaerobic environment for bacteria to thrive. The patient was, in effect, injected with a dose of poison along with the projectile. The true genius and diabolical cruelty of medieval archery, however, lay in the design of the barbed arrowhead. A simple, smooth point, known as a bodkin, was designed to pierce armor, but the broadhead, used against unarmored targets, had two sharp, backward-facing barbs. This design meant that once the arrow was in, it could not simply be pulled out. Attempting to withdraw a barbed arrowhead would cause the barbs to catch on muscle, sinew, and bone, tearing and ripping everything on their way back out. It would turn a simple puncture into a massive internal laceration. The surgeon was left with two terrible options: either push the arrow all the way through the body to exit another side, or make a much larger incision to cut the arrowhead out. Both were excruciating and fraught with peril. Even more formidable than the standard bow and arrow was the crossbow. The crossbow bolt was heavier, flew with a flatter trajectory, and struck with vastly more kinetic energy. It was a projectile capable of punching straight through a coat of mail and sinking deep into the chest or abdominal cavity. It caused injuries of incredible severity, a brutal combination of puncture and blunt force trauma. The surgeon, faced with a man who had taken a crossbow bolt to the gut, knew that the chances of survival were almost zero. The bolt would have perforated the intestines, causing their contents to spill into the abdominal cavity. This led to peritonitis, a swift and agonizingly painful infection that was universally fatal in the pre-antibiotic era. Finally, we must consider the weapon of the medieval elite, the lance. Used in a cavalry charge, the lance was a thick 10 to 12-foot spear of solid wood tipped with a sharp iron point. The injury it caused was not a simple puncture. It was a massive, devastating wound, often capable of impaling a man and lifting him clear off his feet. The tissue damage was immense. Moreover, the sheer force of being struck by a knight on a galloping warhorse was a source of catastrophic trauma in itself. Even if the lance shattered or glanced off, the impact could throw a man to the ground with enough force to break his back, shatter his pelvis, or cause a fatal head injury. The joust was not a sport, it was a training exercise for inflicting maximum possible damage. And so we leave our surgeon for a moment standing and contemplating his next patient. This poor soul is not the victim of a single clean injury. He is a living tapestry of medieval violence. He has a deep sword cut on his left arm, a massive dark bruise on his chest from a mace, and the feathered end of an arrow still protruding from his shoulder. He is bleeding, broken, and terrified. The surgeon's first dreadful question is not, "How do I fix this?" but the far more fundamental, "Where on God's earth do I begin?" We have now confronted the grim realities of medieval medical theory, the terrifying nature of the surgeon's tools, the agony of surgery without anesthesia, and the brutal wounds of the battlefield. All these dreadful threads now converge on a single defining procedure, the grim centerpiece of the surgeon's craft. We must now speak of amputation, the go-to solution for almost everything. In the modern medical world, amputation is a procedure of last resort, a devastating admission that a limb cannot be saved. In the world of the Crusader surgeon, the opposite was true. Amputation was not a last resort. It was often the first, most decisive, and, in their view, most logical course of action for any severe limb injury. It was the brutal, bloody pinnacle of their life-saving art. When in doubt, chop it off. It was the medieval equivalent of turn it off and on again. The rationale behind this aggressive approach stemmed from a combination of grim observation and a profound lack of other options. Surgeons could see with their own eyes what happened to a limb that was hopelessly shattered or turning black with gangrene. They saw the foulness, the stench, and the inexorable spread of death up the limb, a tide that would eventually consume the entire body. To them, the limb was no longer a part of the man. It was a poison entity that had to be cast out. This philosophy was applied to a host of injuries. Did a soldier have a compound fracture with the bones sticking out of the skin? Amputate. Was a limb crushed beyond recognition by a mace or a fallen horse? Amputate. Had a wound begun to swell, turn black, and smell of decay? Amputate, and quickly before the corruption could spread. With no ability to set complex fractures or fight deep infections, removal was the only tool they possessed. So let us walk through this signature procedure, step by agonizing step. Imagine a wounded knight, his leg shattered by a blow from a warhammer. He is brought to the surgeon, who takes one look at the mangled limb, the exposed bone, and the rapidly spreading discoloration. There is no long consultation, no second opinion. The decision is made in an instant. The leg must come off. The knight is given a large drop of strong wine, more to numb his wits than the pain. A leather strap is thrust into his mouth to serve as a bite stick. The surgeon's assistants, grim-faced and powerful, take their positions, 2 on the arms, 2 on the uninjured leg. Their job is not to comfort, but to restrain, to become human clamps and overpower the inevitable pain-fueled struggles of the patient. The surgeon, meanwhile, makes his own preparations. He selects his instruments from his tool roll, a large, broad-bladed knife, a heavy-toothed amputation saw, and several cauterizing irons. which are placed in a nearby brazier to heat until they glow a menacing bright red. He examines the leg, not to see if it can be saved, but to decide where to cut. The cut was always made well above the injury, through what appeared to be healthy tissue, in the desperate hope of getting ahead of the creeping decay. Now the procedure begins. Step 1. The incision. The surgeon takes his large knife, not a delicate scalpel, and with a single powerful motion makes a circular cut through the skin, fat, and muscle of the thigh, slicing all the way down to the bone. This initial cut was intended to create a flap of skin and muscle that, in theory, could be used to cover the exposed stump later on. A small but significant nod to the patient's future, however unlikely it might be. The pain of this initial cut alone would be blinding, a searing ring of fire around the limb. But the agony was just beginning. Next, the surgeon or his assistant would have to retract the flesh, pulling the thick muscle and skin up the leg like a bloody sleeve. This was done to expose a clean section of bone, providing a clear track for the teeth of the saw. Step 2. The saw. This was the main event, the moment of supreme horror. The surgeon places the coarse teeth of his amputation saw against the pale, exposed bone. With his assistant holding the doomed limb steady, he begins to draw the saw back and forth. The sound would have been unforgettable, a wet, grating, rhythmic rasp, punctuated by the high-pitched screams of the patient. The process was neither quick nor easy. Sawing through a large bone like the femur required immense physical effort and several minutes of sustained, brutal work. Bone dust mixed with blood would fill the air. The surgeon, his face likely spattered with gore, would be focused entirely on his gruesome task, his body moving in time with the rhythmic strokes of his terrible instrument. Then, after an eternity of agony, would come the final, sickening crack as the bone was severed completely. The lower leg and foot, now free from the body, would be unceremoniously dropped to the floor or tossed onto a pile with other severed limbs, a testament to the surgeon's busy day. The patient, if still conscious, was now left with a ragged, weeping stump, gushing a torrent of bright red blood. Step 3. The cautery. Now came the most critical and perhaps most dangerous part of the entire operation, stopping the bleeding. An assistant would retrieve one of the glowing, hot cauterizing irons from the fire. The surgeon would take the instrument and press its searing, incandescent tip directly into the open face of the stump. The sound was a sharp, angry sizzle, accompanied by a plume of smoke and the sickeningly sweet smell of burning human flesh. The intense heat would sear the blood vessels shut, turning the raw red meat of the stump into a blackened, charred, and sterile crust. The pain of the cautery iron, applied to a fresh wound of this magnitude, would often be the final insult that would send the patient into the oblivion of shock or death. The surgeon would reapply the iron again and again, searing every part of the open wound until the bleeding slowed to a manageable ooze. He would inspect his handiwork with a critical eye, ensuring the cooking was complete. To the medieval mind, this act was not just about stopping bleeding. The fire was also seen as a way to purify the wound of its poisons. Step 4. Dressing the wound. Once the bleeding was under control, the stump had to be dressed. The surgeon would take his flap of skin and muscle and pull it down over the charred end of the bone, stitching it into place with a thick needle and thread made of animal sinew. This was often a futile gesture, as the stitches would almost certainly tear out when the wound inevitably swelled with infection. A poultice would then be applied. This could be a mixture of various ingredients, often involving egg whites, which would create a hard shell-like covering, along with various herbs believed to have healing properties. This concoction would be slathered onto the stump, and the entire thing would then be wrapped tightly in strips of linen or whatever clean rags were available. The patient, if they had miraculously survived the blood loss, the shock, and the agony of the procedure, was then carried away to recover. Their ordeal, however, was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. The non-sterile conditions of the entire procedure made a subsequent infection a near absolute certainty. Yet, a few days later, when the surgeon unwrapped the stump and found it swollen, red, and weaving a thick, creamy, yellowish-yellow pus, he would not be alarmed. On the contrary, he would be pleased. This was known as laudable pus, and it was wrongly believed to be a sign that the body was successfully expelling the poisons from the wound. In reality, it was the calling card of a raging staphylococcus infection. The pus was laudable, but the survival rates were not. The vast majority of amputation patients would die within days or weeks from secondary infection, the sepsis slowly overwhelming their already weakened bodies. They would succumb to a raging fever, their successful operation having only delayed the inevitable. For the vanishingly small number who did survive, they faced a grim future. They were now disabled in a brutal and unforgiving world, often unable to work or support themselves. They would be left with a painful, weeping stump for the rest of their lives, a constant, foul-smelling reminder of the day they met the surgeon and his saw. The surgeon, meanwhile, having performed his duty, would wipe his tools clean on a rag, ready for the next mangled limb to cross his path. We have now arrived at the final and most formidable adversary of the Crusader surgeon. It was an enemy he could not see, an enemy he did not understand, and an enemy that rendered almost all of his best efforts futile. It was the true victor of nearly every battle, the ultimate arbiter of life and death in the surgical tent. We must now speak of infection, the silent killer and the very, very loud smeller. For all the horrors of the sword, the mace, and the saw, they were at least tangible. A surgeon could see a broken bone or a gaping wound. He could physically remove a barbed arrowhead or a splintered piece of armor. But infection was a phantom menace. It operated on a scale so small as to be pure witchcraft, a malevolent spirit that slipped into every wound, no matter how skillfully it was treated. The entire concept of germ theory was still 600 years in the future. The seeds of this invisible destroyer were sown at the very moment of injury. A sword blade, coated in grime and rust, would inject bacteria directly into the bloodstream. An arrow, having traveled through the air in a soldier's filthy tunic, would carry a payload of contaminants deep into the body. The very soil of the battlefield, rich in animal waste and decaying organic matter, was a fertile breeding ground for tetanus and other deadly microbes. Every wound was a contaminated wound from the very beginning. If the injury itself didn't introduce a fatal dose of filth, the surgeon was more than happy to finish the job. He was, in truth, the archangel of infection, a master of contamination. His unwashed hands would probe a wound, his non-sterile instruments would transfer bacteria from one patient to the next, and his apron, stiff with the blood and gore of previous operations, was a walking catalog of pathogens. He was not just closing wounds, he was inoculating them. Then came the treatment itself, which often amounted to adding insult to injury. With the best of intentions, surgeons would pack wounds with materials that were, in hindsight, outrageously unhygienic. Clean linen was rare, so dirty rags were often used. Moss and cobwebs were popular choices for staunching blood flow, both carrying their own unique assortment of spores and bacteria. In some cases, based on the principle of like cures like, or specific medical theories about drawing out poison, wounds were packed with even more horrifying substances. The most infamous of these was animal dung. A fresh, warm poultice of animal droppings was believed to have powerful healing properties. In reality, it was a 5-star, all-inclusive resort for bacteria, particularly the kind that causes tetanus, a condition characterized by agonizing muscle spasms and known as lockjaw. A few days after the surgery, the first signs of the inevitable would appear. The area around the wound would become red, swollen, and hot to the touch. The patient would complain of a deep throbbing pain. To the modern eye, these are the classic, unambiguous signs of inflammation and infection. To the medieval physician, however, this was often seen as a positive development, a sign that the body's humors were rushing to the site of the injury to begin the battle for healing. Soon after, the star of the show would make its appearance. We must now discuss one of the most dangerously wrong ideas in the history of medicine, the concept of probable pus. The medieval medical community made a distinction between different types of discharge from a wound. If the pus was thick, creamy, and relatively odorless, what we would today recognize as the classic sign of a staphylococcus infection, it was considered a very good thing. This laudable or praiseworthy pus was believed to be a sign that the body was successfully expelling the evil humors or poisons from the wound. A surgeon, upon changing a dressing and finding a copious amount of this thick white fluid, would be delighted. It was a sign that his treatment was working and that the patient was on the road to recovery. He might even use irritating poultices to try and encourage its formation. Of course, not all pus was considered laudable. If the discharge was thin, watery, bloody, and most importantly foul-smelling, even the medieval surgeon knew it was a sign of impending doom. This bad pus, what we would now recognize as the product of a more virulent streptococcal or anaerobic infection, was a clear signal that the body was losing the fight and that the patient would almost certainly die. But for a time, the surgeon would look upon the creamy evidence of a raging staph infection with pride. But what happened when the infection deepened, when the laudable pus was not enough? The bacteria would multiply, choking off the tiny blood vessels that supplied the surrounding tissue with life-giving oxygen. The flesh, starved and poisoned, would begin to die. This is the beginning of gangrene. a word that even today carries a unique sense of dread. The progression of gangrene was a visual and olfactory horror story. The skin around the wound would turn from a healthy red to a bruised, unhealthy purple, then to a mottled, terrifying black. The limb would swell dramatically, the skin becoming stretched and shiny. Foul-smelling blisters, filled with a dark, watery fluid, would begin to erupt on the surface. The limb was, quite literally, rotting while still attached to the body. The smell of gangrene is an experience that, once encountered, is never forgotten. It is a uniquely cloying, sickly sweet, and deeply rotten stench, the smell of decaying flesh. This odor would have been the signature perfume of any Crusader field hospital, a constant, overpowering announcement of the silent killer's work. It was the smell of utter hopelessness, a scent that clung to the surgeon's clothes and haunted his dreams. For the patient, the experience was one of profound psychological terror. They could watch, day by day, as their own arm or leg decomposed before their very eyes. The initial throbbing pain of the infection would often give way to a strange and unsettling numbness as the nerves themselves died, a silent testament to the limb's demise. They were witnessing their own decay, a slow, horrifying preview of the grave. Eventually, the infection would break containment. The bacteria, having conquered the limb, would invade the bloodstream, a catastrophic event known as sepsis, or blood poisoning. This was the beginning of the end. The poison was no longer localized. It was now systemic, a raging torrent of death flowing through the entire body. The surgeon was now utterly powerless. The symptoms of sepsis were dramatic and terrifying. The patient would be seized by violent, uncontrollable shaking chills, their teeth chattering even as a raging fever burned them from within. Their heart would race, their pulse becoming rapid and weak. As the infection reached the brain, they would become confused, disoriented, and eventually delirious, shouting nonsense or speaking to people who were not there. The body, in a last, desperate attempt to fight the overwhelming invasion, would begin to shut down. The patient's breathing would become shallow and rapid. Their skin would become cool and clammy to the touch. Their organs, the kidneys, the liver, would begin to fail. The vibrant, fighting soldier of a few days ago would become lethargic, weak, and unresponsive. And the end usually came in one of two ways. Some would simply slip quietly into a final, irreversible coma, their body finally giving up the impossible fight. Others would die in a state of feverish delirium, their last moments a confused and terrifying nightmare. Either way, death was the only possible outcome. The silent killer had claimed another victim. And so we see the grim truth. The most fearsome enemy a Crusader faced was not the warrior with a scimitar he met on the battlefield. It was the invisible world of microbes he carried on his own skin, on the surgeon's hands, and in the very soil he fought to conquer. A soldier could survive the battle, survive the surgeon's saw, and survive the agony of the cautery iron, only to be killed a week later by an enemy he never knew existed. If the sword didn't get you, the laudable pus certainly would. We have reached a crucial juncture in our journey into the miseries of the Crusader surgeon. The battle has been fought, the wound has been inflicted, the limb has been sawn off, and the stump has been seared with a glowing iron. Now the surgeon and his patient enter a new and terrifying phase of their relationship, the waiting game. They are waiting for the body to heal, but they are not looking for the clean, quiet closure we expect today. They are waiting for something to emerge from the wound, a sign from within. They are waiting for pus. To the modern mind, the appearance of pus in a wound is an unambiguous sign of trouble, a clear indication of infection that requires immediate attention. To the medieval surgeon, the situation was far more nuanced. He believed with absolute certainty that not all pus was created equal. In his world, there was good, healthy, laudable pus, and there was deadly, foul, bad pus. The fate of the patient depended entirely on which kind decided to make an appearance. This entire philosophy was built upon the bedrock of humoral theory. A wound, they believed, was a site where the body's four humors were thrown into violent disarray. Illness was caused by an imbalance or corruption of these humors, so, naturally, healing must involve expelling the corrupting influence. Pus, therefore, was not seen as a product of infection, but as the physical evidence of the body successfully ejecting the bad humors, the literal poison, from the wound. It was a visible sign of the body purifying itself. Let us first examine the substance that brought a smile to the surgeon's face and a glimmer of hope to the patient's family. Let us speak in praise of Laudable pus. This was the gold standard of wound discharge, the sign that everything was proceeding according to plan. Its appearance was specific, and surgeons would look for it with the anxious eye of a prospector searching for a vein of gold. Laudable pus was described as being thick, uniform, and creamy, much like the consistency of fresh cream. Its color was a healthy white, or perhaps a yellowish white like curdled milk. Crucially, it was relatively odorless. To the surgeon, this was not the discharge of a festering wound, but a kind of healing balm, a substance generated by the body's own wisdom. Its presence meant nature was taking its proper course. Upon changing a dressing and discovering a copious amount of this thick, creamy fluid, the surgeon would be genuinely pleased. He would see it as a vindication of his methods. He might proudly point it out to onlookers as proof that the patient's body was strong and was successfully fighting off the affliction. "Behold," he might say, "the corruption flows out. This is a very good sign." The patient, lying in agony, was expected to be comforted by this news. Of course, we now know the grim truth. This so-called laudable pus is the classic clinical sign of a localized infection, most commonly caused by the bacterium Staphylococcus aureus. The thick, creamy consistency is not a magical healing fluid, but a grotesque and tragic slurry. It is composed of billions of dead bacteria, a vast army of the body's own white blood cells that have rushed to the site and died fighting, and the liquefied remains of the patient's own decomposing tissue. The reason it was relatively odorless is that Staphylococcus is a non-gas-producing bacterium. The pus was praiseworthy simply because it lacked the putrid stench of other, more dangerous infections. The surgeon was in essence celebrating the formation of a massive contained abscess. He was looking at a teeming battlefield of microscopic death and calling it a victory parade. So why do they believe this was a good sign? The correlation, though flawed, likely came from simple observation. A patient with a strong immune system would be more capable of mounting a powerful localized response to an infection. This robust response would produce a great deal of thick, laudable pus. That same strong immune system might be just enough to allow the patient to survive despite the infection, not because of it. They mistook a symptom of a strong fight for the cause of the victory. This fundamental misunderstanding led to one of the most dangerous practices in medieval medicine, the active encouragement of pus formation. Since laudable pus was a sign of healing, it stood to reason that a surgeon should do everything in his power to help the body produce it. Wounds were often intentionally irritated to stimulate what they called suppuration, or the generation of pus. This could be done by packing the wound with rough, irritating materials, such as coarse linen or even specially chosen splinters of wood. Some medical texts advocated for applying poultices made from things like lard and pigeon droppings, believing these substances had the right properties to draw out the bad humors and create a good, healthy festering. The surgeon was no longer just a bystander. He was an active farmer of infection. Now we must turn our attention to the dreaded alternative, the substance that would cause the surgeon's heart to sink. If, upon inspecting a wound, he found not a thick, creamy discharge, but a thin, watery, and discolored fluid, he knew the patient's fate was likely sealed. This was bad pus, a sign that the body was losing its battle in the most spectacular fashion. This bad pus, sometimes called Sanius or Icarus, had a terrifying appearance. It could be greenish, a bloody reddish-brown, or a thin, watery gray. Unlike laudable pus, it was almost always accompanied by a truly foul, putrid stench, the unmistakable smell of decay and death. This was not the noble discharge of a body healing itself. This was the effluent of the grave. The surgeon's reaction to this sight would be one of despair and resignation. It was the universally recognized sign of a fatal outcome. There were no effective treatments for this condition. He might offer prayers, he might try a different, more desperate poultice, but he knew in his heart that the patient was beyond his help. The appearance of bad pus was the beginning of the death watch. Once again, modern science can explain what the medieval surgeon was observing but could not understand. This thin, watery, foul-smelling discharge was the sign of a different, often more virulent type of infection. Bacteria like Streptococcus produce enzymes such as streptokinase and hyaluronidase, which actively break down the body's attempts to wall off the infection, resulting in a much thinner pus. Furthermore, the truly foul smell was often the work of anaerobic bacteria, microbes that thrive in the absence of oxygen deep within a wound. These bacteria, such as those that cause gas gangrene, produce noxious sulfurous gases as a byproduct of their metabolism. So, when the surgeon recoiled from the stench, he was correctly identifying a far more aggressive and invasive infection, one that was spreading rapidly and would soon become systemic. This distinction between the two types of pus represents a strange and tragic moment in medical history. The medieval surgeon was, in his own way, performing a crude but effective piece of microbiology. He was differentiating between a contained staph infection and a raging strep or gangrenous infection based purely on the macroscopic appearance and smell of the wound discharge. He was right about which one was more deadly, but he was catastrophically wrong about why. This deeply ingrained belief in the virtue of laudable pus was perhaps the single greatest barrier to medical progress for centuries. It actively worked against the very concept of cleanliness and antisepsis. If your primary goal in wound care is to encourage a healthy festering, then why would you ever wash your hands? Why would you clean your instruments? Why would you use clean dressings? A clean wound, one that healed by first intention without producing any pus, was often viewed with suspicion. It was considered unnatural. Some surgeons believed such a wound needed to be corrupted with a dirty probe or a foul poultice to kickstart the normal healing process. The very thing we strive for today, a clean, pus-free closure, was seen as a dangerous and undesirable outcome. There were, it should be said, a few lone voices of reason in this era. Surgeons like Theodoric of Lucca in the 13th century argued against pus formation, advocating that wounds should be cleaned with wine, a mild antiseptic, and closed up to heal cleanly. But he was largely ignored. The dogma of laudable pus was too powerful, too deeply entrenched in the medical traditions passed down from the ancient Greeks. Imagine for a moment the experience of the patient. You lie in a state of constant grinding pain, your body fighting a desperate battle against infection, and your doctor, the man entrusted with your care, tells you that the foul, weeping discharge from your wound is a wonderful sign. He actively encourages it to fester more, assuring you that this is the path to health. The psychological torment of being told that your body's decay is a laudable event is almost too much to comprehend. And so, the concept of laudable pus stands as a monument to one of the most persistent and deadly misunderstandings in the entire history of medicine. It turned the surgeon from a potential healer into an unwitting cultivator of disease. It sanctified infection, celebrated contamination, and condemned countless thousands of patients to a painful, feverish, and entirely preventable death. The road to the medieval cemetery was paved with good intentions and thick, creamy, laudable pus. We have until now focused on the individual trials of the Crusader surgeon, the flawed theories, the terrifying tools, the mangled bodies, and the specter of infection in a single wound. But now we must pull back our focus, from the microscopic horror of a single bacterium to the macroscopic horror of the environment that spawned it. We must venture into the heart of darkness itself, the Crusader army camp, a sprawling temporary city of unparalleled filth and the perfect breeding ground for disease. An army on the march, particularly one as large and diverse as a crusading host, is essentially a city on the move. It is a teeming metropolis of tens of thousands of souls, complete with its own social structure, its own economy, and its own support services. However, this medieval city had one glaring omission in its urban planning. It had no sanitation department. It was a metropolis without sewers, a community without clean water, and a society without the slightest inkling of germ theory. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer density of life. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, from noble armored knights to humble foot soldiers and archers. They were accompanied by a vast support network of squires, pilgrims, priests, merchants, cooks, blacksmiths, and a sea of desperate camp followers. And then there were the animals, thousands of war horses, pack mules, and livestock, all living, eating, and defecating in the same confined space as the humans. The temporary nature of these camps was a critical part of the problem. Since the army was always on the move, or at least intended to be, there was no incentive to build any kind of permanent sanitary infrastructure. Why dig deep, well-managed latrines when you plan to abandon the site in a few weeks? The result was a city designed to be disposable, a place that would be consumed by its own filth before being left behind as a toxic scar on the landscape. Let us begin our tour with the most pressing and voluminous issue, human waste. With tens of thousands of men eating and drinking every day, the camp produced a truly staggering amount of human excrement. The best-case scenario for waste management was the digging of shallow trenches or latrine pits, usually located on the edge of the camp. The worst-case scenario, and likely the more common one, was that soldiers simply relieved themselves wherever was convenient. These latrine trenches, when they existed, were often dug too close to the main camp, and crucially too close to the water supply. They were open to the air, attracting swarms of flies that would happily commute between the trenches and the cooking pots, providing a remarkably efficient shuttle service for disease-causing bacteria. The stench emanating from these areas would have been a constant, inescapable feature of camp life. Next, we must consider the animal waste. A crusading army ran on horsepower. The thousands of war horses, essential for the knight's charges, and the countless mules and oxen required to carry supplies, produced many tons of manure every single day. This manure was simply left where it fell, trampled into the mud, creating a thick, foul carpet that covered the entire camp. Like the human waste, it was a paradise for flies and other insects. Now we turn to the camp's lifeblood and its most effective killer, the water supply. A Crusader army always camped near a source of fresh water, typically a river or a large stream. This single body of water had to serve every purpose. Far upstream, men would, if they were wise, collect the water for drinking and cooking. A little further downstream, other men would be watering their horses, butchering animals for the evening meal, and washing their filthy clothes. And at the bottom end of the camp, inevitably this same river would be used as a convenient sewer, receiving the runoff from the latrine trenches and the general waste of the camp. This created a perfect flowing system for the transmission of waterborne diseases. The man drinking upstream was, in effect, drinking the toilet water of the man camping a mile ahead of him. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery didn't just have an entry point into the camp, they had a superhighway. The preparation of food was another link in this chain of contamination. Cooking was done in open-air kitchens, often in large communal pots over smoky fires. There was no refrigeration, so meat from butchered animals had to be cooked and eaten quickly before it spoiled. The cooks, like everyone else, had unwashed hands, and the flies made a constant journey from the horse manure and latrine pits to the stew that was being prepared for the evening meal. Personal hygiene, as we would understand it, was a complete fantasy. Water was often too precious to be wasted on bathing, which was infrequent at best. A soldier would wear the same set of woolen or leather clothes for weeks or even months on end. These clothes, soaked with sweat, dirt, and blood, became a thriving ecosystem for parasites. The most common of these unwelcome guests were lice. Body lice were a constant torment, their bites causing intense itching and discomfort. But they were more than just an annoyance. Lice are the primary vectors for epidemic typhus, a deadly disease that thrives in crowded, unhygienic conditions. The Crusader camp was in essence a five-star hotel and breeding ground for the typhus-carrying louse. From this primordial soup of filth, disease was not just a risk, it was an absolute certainty. And the most common and feared of all camp diseases was dysentery, known graphically as the bloody flux. Caused by bacteria like Shigella, which thrives in contaminated food and water, its symptoms were swift and brutal. A soldier would be struck by violent diarrhea, agonizing abdominal cramps, fever, and vomiting. As the infection ravaged the intestines, the diarrhea would become mixed with blood and mucus, the horrifying symptom that gave the disease its name. The rapid loss of fluids led to severe dehydration, weakness, and, in a great many cases, death. It would spread through the camp like wildfire, passed from man to man through the shared water supply. Dysentery was often joined by its equally lethal cousins, typhoid and cholera. These were the camp fevers that so many chronicles of the Crusades describe. They produced similar symptoms: high fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme fatigue, often accompanied by a telltale rash. A man could be healthy in the morning and be in the grip of a delirious, fatal fever by nightfall. The historical record is unambiguous. Far more Crusaders, by an order of magnitude, died from disease than were ever killed in combat. The true graveyard of the Crusades was not the battlefield, but the camp. Sieges were particularly deadly. An army laying siege to a city was forced to remain stationary for months, stewing in its own accumulating filth, slowly poisoning its own water supply, and creating the perfect storm for a catastrophic epidemic. And what of our surgeon in the midst of such an epidemic? What role did this master of the knife and saw play when the true enemy was not a sword, but a bacterium? The answer is the final and perhaps greatest indignity of his career. He was rendered almost completely and utterly useless. His entire skill set, built around responding to physical trauma, was irrelevant. You cannot amputate a fever. You cannot cauterize a flux. You cannot use forceps to pull a bacterium from a man's intestines. The surgeon's tools lay idle while men all around him were dying from an enemy he could neither see nor fight. His complex theories of humoral imbalance offered no effective cure for the bloody flux. He could prescribe herbal remedies to soothe a patient's stomach, but they were little more than placebo. His role in the face of an epidemic shifted dramatically. He was no longer a surgeon, he was a manager of the dying. He was a witness. He might be tasked with separating the sick from the healthy, a futile gesture in such a contaminated environment. He might offer a sip of wine, a word of comfort, or a final prayer. He became less a man of medicine and more of a glorified hospice nurse, presiding over a ward of the doomed. And so we see that the ultimate misery for the Crusader surgeon was not the screaming of his patients or the stench of laudable pus. It was his own profound irrelevance in the face of the camp's greatest and most relentless killer. He was a specialist in the art of fixing bodies broken by violence, but he was living in a world where the very ground beneath his feet The water in his cup and the air he breathed were far more deadly than any enemy army. His title was surgeon, but during an epidemic his real job was simply counting the dead. We have navigated a landscape of profound suffering. We have explored the flawed medical theories, the terrifying tools, the agony of the patient, the horror of the wounds, and the silent, creeping death of infection. But to fully understand why it sucked to be a Crusader surgeon, we must now leave the realm of the physical entirely and venture into the world of the spirit, into the pervasive and powerful domain of medical superstition. In the deeply religious world of the Middle Ages, there was no clear dividing line between the health of the body and the state of the soul. The practice of medicine was inextricably intertwined with the practice of faith. Ailments were not simply a matter of imbalanced humors or physical trauma. They were potent messages from a higher power. Sickness could be a punishment for sin, a test of one's faith, or the direct result of demonic influence. This meant that every illness and every injury required a two-pronged approach to treatment. One approach was physical, administered by the surgeon with his saws and his salves. The other was spiritual, administered by the priest with his prayers and his sacraments. The surgeon was never the only healer in the room. He always worked in the shadow of the Almighty, and often in the more immediate shadow of the local clergyman. The diagnosis itself, therefore, was not just a medical assessment but a spiritual one. Before a surgeon could even begin his work, a priest might be called to assess the spiritual state of the patient. Was this wound the result of simple misfortune in battle, or was it a sign of God's displeasure? The answer to that question would profoundly influence the course of treatment, determining whether the primary need was for a bandage or for penance. Let us explore the tools of this spiritual medicine, which were considered just as vital, if not more so, than the surgeon's iron instruments. The first, most common, and most accessible of these was, of course, prayer. Prayer was the universal prescription, the foundational treatment upon which all others were built. It was a constant presence in the surgical tent, a low murmur of Latin beneath the screams of the patient. A priest might be called to pray directly over a festering wound, asking God to drive out the evil that had taken root there. The patient's family would be instructed to pray for the intercession of a particular saint. The patient themselves, if conscious, would be expected to pray for forgiveness and deliverance. These were not seen as mere words of comfort. They were believed to be tangible, powerful interventions that could alter physical reality. The next tool in the spiritual arsenal was holy water. This was simply water that had been blessed by a priest, imbuing it with a sacred, purifying quality. It was the spiritual equivalent of an antiseptic. A surgeon, either by his own piety or at the insistence of a cleric, might be instructed to wash a wound not with wine or vinegar, but with holy water, cleansing it not of dirt and microbes, but of demonic influence and the stain of sin. While washing a wound with any water was better than nothing, the emphasis on its holiness rather than its actual cleanliness meant that the source of the water was often overlooked. Holy water drawn from a contaminated camp river was still holy, even if it was teeming with the bacteria that caused dysentery. The blessing was believed to supersede the filth. But the most serious cases, when prayer and holy water were not enough, it was time to bring out the heavy artillery of celestial medicine. Holy relics. Relics were the physical remains of saints, a sliver of bone, a lock of hair, a tooth, or objects that they had come into contact with, such as a piece of their clothing. These were not considered mere symbols. They were believed to be physical objects charged with divine power, spiritual batteries containing the miraculous healing energy of the saint. The application of a relic was a common medical procedure. A reliquary, the often inordinate container holding the relic, would be brought to the patient's side. It would then be physically touched to the afflicted part of the body, pressed against a swollen limb, laid upon a feverish forehead, or touched to the edges of a gaping wound. The hope was for a direct transfer of power, an instant miraculous cure that would render the surgeon's clumsy efforts unnecessary. This led to a high degree of spiritual specialization. Just as a modern patient might see a cardiologist for a heart problem, a medieval patient would appeal to a specific saint for a specific ailment. Saints Cosmas and Damian, who were physicians in life, were the patron saints of surgeons and doctors. Saint Roche was the go-to intercessor for victims of the plague. One prayed to Saint Blaise for ailments of the throat and to Saint Lawrence for burns. Praying to the wrong saint was like dialing the wrong heavenly department. For the wealthy, the noble, or the truly desperate, the ultimate act of medical faith was the pilgrimage. If a local relic failed to produce a cure, one could undertake a long and arduous journey to a major shrine, a place known for its powerful relics and frequent miracles. It was the medieval equivalent of seeking treatment at a world-renowned specialty hospital, albeit one run by the long-dead saints. So how did the surgeon, a man of practical, if bloody, craft, coexist with this world of relics and prayers? For the most part, the two systems worked in tandem. The surgeon was a pious man himself, a product of his deeply religious culture. He would have seen no contradiction in his work. He was merely God's humble, if gore-spattered, instrument. Tending to the body was his job. Tending to the soul was the priest's. It is almost certain that a surgeon would have begun any major procedure, like an amputation, with a prayer of his own. He would have prayed for a steady hand, for the patient's endurance, and for a successful outcome, acknowledging his own limitations in the face of God's ultimate power. His work was a craft, but its success was always in divine hands. However, this alliance between the surgeon and the priest was not always an easy one. There was clear potential for conflict. A priest might declare a wound to be a divine punishment, and that any attempt by the surgeon to interfere would be an act of defiance against God's will. More commonly, a successful recovery would be attributed not to the surgeon's skill, but to the power of a saint's relic, diminishing the surgeon's professional standing. This spiritual dimension also provided the surgeon with a convenient and unassailable excuse for failure. Given the appallingly high mortality rates associated with medieval surgery, this was an invaluable tool. When a patient died after an amputation, which they almost always did, the surgeon could absolve himself of responsibility. My work was flawless, he might declare. The limb was removed with great skill. But it was God's will to call this good man to paradise. Who could argue with that? Now we must address the central, darkly humorous irony of this entire situation, the fact that, in a very real sense, the spiritual healing often worked better than the actual surgery. This is not to say that relics could miraculously cure gangrene, but rather that the surgeon's own interventions were so often actively harmful. A surgeon cutting into a patient with a non-sterile knife, probing a wound with unwashed fingers, and then packing it with dung was, in effect, administering a fatal dose of infection. The surgery itself was often the cause of death. In this context, a treatment that involved simply praying over a wound or touching it with a reliquary was, at the very least, less likely to kill the patient. So by doing nothing physically harmful, the spiritual cure allowed the body's own immune system to fight the infection without the added burden of new contaminants introduced by the surgeon. The powerful placebo effect of a sacred ritual could also provide comfort, reduce stress, and perhaps bolster the patient's will to live. In a grim contest between actively harmful surgery and passively harmless superstition, the superstition sometimes had the better odds. The profound reliance on relics and holy interventions was therefore born of desperation and a complete lack of effective alternatives. For the Crusader surgeon, the world of the spirit was a constant partner in his bloody work. It was at times a source of comfort, at other times a professional hindrance, and, in the most tragic and absurd paradox of all, sometimes the only reason his patients survived his care was the final inescapable complication in his uniquely miserable career. We have waded through the filth of the army camp and witnessed the awesome power of misguided faith. Now we return to the surgeon's tent, to the visceral reality of his daily work. We must focus on the single most common and uniquely frustrating injury he faced, the arrow wound. For every soldier felled by a sword or a mace, dozens more were struck by the rain of projectiles that defined the medieval battlefield, and removing these arrows was a special kind of horror. Imagine the sky above a Crusader battlefield. At any given moment during an engagement, it could be darkened by a literal storm of arrows, 1,000 wooden shafts arcing through the air to fall upon the ranks of soldiers below. The sound would have been a constant, terrifying whisper, the sound of death on the wing. For the surgeon, this meant a steady and unrelenting stream of patients, each presenting with their own unique and terrible puncture wound. The arrow itself was a marvel of deadly efficiency, a perfect delivery system not just for a sharp point, but for infection. The wooden shaft, often roughly made, could splinter upon impact, leaving tiny, hard-to-find fragments of wood deep inside the wound. The fletching, the feathers at the back of the arrow, could also be driven into the flesh, and of course the arrow carried with it a sample of every dirty thing it touched on its journey. Dirt from the ground, fibers from the archer's quiver, and a piece of the victim's own filthy tunic. The business end of the arrow, the arrowhead, came in various designs. For shooting at armored opponents, an archer would use a bodkin point, a long, narrow, and sharp spike of iron designed to punch through chainmail. But against unarmored men and horses, they used the far more insidious broadhead, and it is this weapon with its cruel and ingenious design that caused the Crusader surgeon so much misery. The villain of our story today is the barbed broadhead arrowhead. Its design was simple and brutal. It consisted of a sharp central point, but behind this point the head would flare out into 2 or more sharp wings or barbs that angled backwards, away from the tip. It looked in profile like a vicious metal fishhook, and it worked on exactly the same principle. The brutal logic of the barbed arrowhead was all about making removal as difficult and damaging as possible. On its way into the body, it was streamlined, slicing easily through skin and muscle, but any attempt to simply pull the arrow straight back out was doomed to failure. The backward-facing barbs would instantly snag on muscle tissue, nerves, and blood vessels like a fishhook in a fish's mouth. To pull on the arrow shaft was to tear and rip everything the barbs had hooked into. It would transform a relatively neat puncture wound into a massive internal laceration, causing excruciating pain and catastrophic bleeding. Every soldier and every surgeon knew this simple, terrible truth: a barbed arrow could not simply be pulled out. The problem required a far more invasive and agonizing solution. So let's follow the procedure. A soldier is carried into the surgeon's tent, a feathered arrow shaft protruding from his shoulder. He is understandably in a state of great pain and terror. The surgeon's first job is not to cut, but to assess. He must determine the depth of the wound, the angle of entry, and most importantly, what kind of arrowhead is lodged deep inside the patient's flesh. He would begin by carefully probing the wound. This might be done with a clean, by his standards, finger or with a long, thin metal probe. He would gently feel his way along the arrow shaft, trying to get a sense of the shape of the head and whether it was lodged in soft tissue or stuck in bone. This initial exploration, performed on a conscious patient, would have been an ordeal in itself. Once the surgeon confirmed his suspicion that he was dealing with a barbed head, he knew that the easy path was closed to him. The real work had to begin. He now had to choose between two primary and equally terrible methods of extraction. The patient, held down by assistants, could only pray that the surgeon chose wisely and worked quickly. Option 1 was the cut-down method. If the arrowhead was not buried too deeply, the surgeon would take his scalpel and make a much larger incision around the arrow's entry point. He would methodically slice through the layers of skin, fat, and muscle, following the path of the arrow shaft down towards the hidden head. The goal was to surgically expose the arrowhead in its entirety. This procedure effectively turned a small, deep puncture wound into a large, open surgical wound. Once the arrowhead was exposed, the surgeon could see or feel the barbs, carefully disengage them from whatever tissue they had hooked, and then with a pair of forceps, carefully lift the arrowhead out of the now gaping hole. The wound would then be packed and dressed, its large size making it even more susceptible to a fatal infection. Option 2 was the dramatic and horrifying push-through technique. This was typically used when an arrow had passed most of the way through a fleshy part of the body, like the thigh, the calf, or the upper arm. Seeing that the head was closer to the far side of the limb than the entry point, the surgeon would make a truly terrifying decision. He would push the arrow the rest of the way through. Gripping the arrow shaft firmly, the surgeon would apply steady, agonizing pressure, forcing the barbed head to continue its journey through the patient's body until its bloody, vicious tip emerged from the other side. The patient was left with the arrow shaft passing completely through their limb. The sight alone would have been a vision from a nightmare. Once the head was exposed on the far side, the surgeon would take a pair of heavy iron snips and cut the arrowhead off from the wooden shaft. With the barbed head now disposed of, he could simply withdraw the harmless, smooth shaft back out the way it came in. The patient was now left with 2 wounds instead of 1, an entry wound and an exit wound, both of which required dressing, and both of which would almost certainly become infected. Some surgeons had specialized tools, such as spoon-like scoops or hollow tubes called cannulas, that were designed to aid in extraction. The idea was to slide the tube down the arrow shaft to cover the barbs, theoretically allowing for a smooth withdrawal. In practice, these instruments were clumsy, difficult to deploy in a bloody and uncooperative wound, and often caused more internal tearing and damage in the process of their insertion. The absolute nightmare scenario for both surgeon and patient was the broken shaft. If the arrow shaft snapped off upon impact or during the patient's journey to the surgeon, the barbed arrowhead would be left behind, lost somewhere deep inside the body. The surgeon was now faced with an almost impossible task, finding a small piece of metal in a deep, bleeding, and rapidly swelling wound, completely by feel. This is where the grim game of find the arrow splinter would begin. The surgeon would be forced to probe the wound repeatedly, his fingers and instruments exploring the depths of the injury in a blind and desperate search. Each exploratory poke would risk further damage to nerves and blood vessels, all while the patient endured wave after wave of unimaginable agony. Congratulations! You've survived the battle. Now for the exploratory surgery with no anesthetic. Even a successful extraction, where the arrowhead was removed in one piece, was merely the end of the first chapter of the ordeal. The patient now had a deep, contaminated wound, a perfect gateway for infection to set in. The real battle The one against gangrene and sepsis was only just beginning. Furthermore, the surgeon had no way of knowing the full extent of the internal damage the arrow had caused on its journey. Had it passed cleanly through muscle, or had it nicked a femoral artery? Had it perforated a lung, or chipped a piece of bone that was now floating freely inside the patient? The surgeon could only patch the hole and wait anxiously to see if the patient developed massive internal bleeding or began coughing up blood. And so, we see that for the Crusader surgeon, the humble arrow represented a perfect storm of professional misery. It was a dirty, splintering projectile, often tipped with a cleverly designed, flesh-gripping head. Its removal required a brutal and invasive procedure that transformed a small wound into a much larger one, and even if removed, it left behind a legacy of unknown internal damage and near-certain infection. Dealing with arrow wounds was not just a part of the job, it was a daily, frustrating, and often fatal masterclass in the horrors of medieval trauma. We have spent a great deal of time exploring the myriad reasons why it was an exquisitely awful experience to be a patient of a Crusader surgeon. We have journeyed through a landscape of flawed theories, terrifying tools, and overwhelming infection. But now, for our final chapter, we must turn the lens around. We must look at this world of suffering not from the perspective of the man on the table, but from the perspective of the man holding the saw. For it truly deeply sucked to be a Crusader surgeon. Throughout this series, we have treated the surgeon as an agent of misery, an unwitting, gore-spattered angel of death. But he was not some immune observer, gliding through the filth and horror untouched. He was a participant. He was a man living and working in the very heart of the same vortex of danger that consumed his patients. His professional life was not just difficult, it was a daily gamble with his own life. Let us begin with the most basic risk, his environment. The surgeon lived, ate, and slept in the same squalid, disease-ridden army camp as every other soldier. He drank the same water, teeming with the bacteria that caused dysentery and cholera. He was bitten by the same typhus-carrying lice that infested the blankets of the men he treated. His medical knowledge, based on the fantasy of the four humors, offered him no special protection from the genuine biological threats that surrounded him. In fact, his position often put him at an even greater risk. As the primary caregiver for the sick and wounded, he was the first point of contact for any new disease sweeping through the camp. The men suffering from the first signs of a new plague or a virulent fever were brought directly to his tent. He was, in essence, the canary in the camp's coal mine, constantly exposed to the most concentrated doses of every pestilence that arose. Beyond the general dangers of the camp, the surgeon faced a host of specific occupational hazards, risks born directly from the nature of his gruesome work. Chief among these was the simple, constant, and unprotected contact with disease. He worked day in and day out with his bare hands plunged into the stuff of sickness, blood, pus, urine, and infected tissue. He had no gloves, no mask, no concept of barrier nursing. Every wound he touched was a potential source of contamination. Every dressing he changed was a chance for a deadly microbe to pass from his patient to him. He would end each day covered in a patina of other people's bodily fluids, each one a potential death sentence. He would wipe his hands on an apron that was already stiff with the biological history of a dozen other men. This constant exposure created the ever-present danger of the accidental cut. Imagine our surgeon working by the flickering light of a torch, trying to perform a delicate task on a patient who is screaming and thrashing in agony. The risk of an accidental slip of the knife, a nick from a scalpel, or a prick from a suture needle was extraordinarily high. In our modern world, such a small cut would be a minor annoyance. For the Crusader surgeon, it was a potentially fatal event. If his blade was contaminated with the blood of a patient suffering from a raging infection, and whose blood wasn't, that infection was now directly in his own bloodstream. He had, in a single, clumsy moment, inoculated himself with the very death he was trying to treat. The chaotic environment of his operating theater was a constant source of danger. A patient in a violent spasm of pain could knock over the brazier, sending hot coals and glowing cauterizing irons skittering across the floor of the tent. An amputation, a procedure that required immense physical force, could become a dangerous struggle, risking injury to both surgeon and his assistants. And the dangers were not just biological or accidental, they were also social. A surgeon's status was that of a lowly craftsman, a notch above a butcher. If a common foot soldier died on his table, it was of little consequence, but if the patient was a wealthy and powerful nobleman, the surgeon's own life could be on the line. If a baron or a duke died after a procedure, his grieving and angry family might not be inclined to accept God's will as an explanation. They might instead seek a more terrestrial scapegoat. The surgeon could be accused of incompetence, of malice, or even of murder. In a world governed by honor and retribution, a failed surgery on the wrong patient could result in the surgeon facing a swift and brutal form of medieval malpractice review at the end of a sword. Beyond the immediate dangers to his life, we must consider the sheer physical toll of the job. This was not a profession for the faint of heart or the weak of body. After a major battle, the surgeon would be faced with a tidal wave of casualties, forced to work for days on end with little sleep, fueled by adrenaline and perhaps a little wine. The work itself was grueling manual labor. The act of sawing through a man's femur required incredible stamina and upper body strength. Helping the assistants to restrain a powerful knight, mad with pain, was a physically draining struggle. The surgeon was not a contemplative scholar like the physician. He was a manual worker whose medium was flesh and bone. And then there was the sensory assault, the overwhelming and inescapable environment of disgust. We can only imagine the psychological fortitude required to function in such a world. The soundtrack of his life was the constant screaming of men in agony. His daily view was a parade of mangled limbs, gaping wounds, and dying bodies. But above all, there was the stench, the inescapable, thick and cloying smell that would have permeated the surgeon's tent, his clothes, his hair, and his very being. It was a complex and horrifying perfume composed of fresh blood, coppery and sharp, of laudable pus, thick and strangely inert, of gangrene, sickly, sweet and rotten, and of the general unwashed filth of the camp. It was the smell of suffering and decay, and it was the air he breathed every single day. This leads us to the final and perhaps heaviest burden, the mental and emotional toll. How could any person endure such a profession without being crushed by it? The surgeon was surrounded by constant and overwhelming failure. He knew with a grim certainty that the vast majority of his patients with serious injuries were going to die, no matter what he did. He was a man armed with a handful of useless theories and brutal techniques, fighting a losing war against pain, trauma, and an invisible army of microbes. He was a master of a craft that mostly failed. The psychological weight of that reality, the burden of being the last hope for so many and yet so rarely succeeding, must have been immense. To this we must add the constant indignity of his low social status. He performed the most difficult, disgusting, and dangerous work in the medical field, yet he was looked down upon by the university-educated physicians who refused to get their hands dirty. He received none of the glory of the knights he patched up, only the guts. His was a thankless, bloody, and often short-lived career. And so, the Crusader surgeon walked a razor's edge every day of his professional life. He could be killed by the same epidemic of dysentery that was wiping out the infantry. He could die from a single, careless slip of his own scalpel. He could be murdered by the vengeful family of a nobleman who died under his care. He could simply collapse from sheer physical and mental exhaustion. The grim irony is that he was almost as likely to die from his profession as his patients were. His work offered him no special protection, no hazard pay, and certainly no benefits. It was a job that demanded everything from him: his strength, his nerve, his stomach, his very soul. And in return, it offered him little more than a constant, intimate relationship with blood, pus, and death. We have come to the end of our exploration into the miserable life of the Crusader surgeon. We have seen that he operated within a system of flawed science, with brutal tools and no relief for his patient's pain. We have seen the horrific injuries he faced and the invisible infections that defeated him. But the final and perhaps most profound reason it truly sucked to be him was that he was not immune to the world he inhabited. He was not a healer set apart from the suffering. He was a fellow victim, a man destined to live and most likely die in the very same world of filth, danger, and despair he was trying, so often failing, to fix. We have reached the end of our long and lamentable journey into the world of the Crusader surgeon. We have walked through the bloody, filth-strewn corridors of medieval medicine, and it is now time to close the door on this chapter of horrific healing. Together, we have seen that for every celebrated knight charging into glorious battle, there was another man standing in a dimly lit tent, preparing to perform a job that was anything but glory. We began with the fundamental disconnect of the age, the lofty, university-educated physician who diagnosed with astrology and pondered the balance of the four humors, and the lowly barber-surgeon who was left to deal with the messy reality of the human body. One prescribed potions and prayers from a safe distance. The other rolled up his sleeves and plunged his hands into the viscera of trauma. We have stared into the surgeon's toolkit and found not the precise instruments of a healer, but the crude and terrifying implements of a butcher. We saw saws designed for wood, knives coated in rust, and cauterizing irons that promised a choice between bleeding to death and dying from the agony of being burned. We had listened to the screams of the patient, a constant soundtrack to procedures performed without the mercy of anesthesia, where the only pain management was a swig of wine and 4 strong men holding you down. We have surveyed the brutal landscape of the battlefield, cataloging the catastrophic damage inflicted by sword, mace, and the uniquely wicked barbed arrowhead. We have then retreated to the army camp, only to find a far deadlier enemy lurking in the contaminated water and the ever-present filth, an enemy that unleashed epidemics of dysentery and typhus, rendering the surgeon and his skills tragically irrelevant. We have untangled the bizarre and deadly logic of medical superstition, where laudable pus was seen as a sign of healing, and where prayer and holy relics were considered viable and sometimes less harmful alternatives to surgery. And finally, we have considered the surgeon's own miserable existence, a life of low status, constant danger, and overwhelming sensory and emotional fatigue, a job with no benefits, just more blood. And so we are left with a final diagnosis of the surgeon's lot. While the knights fought for God and glory, the Crusader surgeon fought a far more desperate and intimate war. His enemies were not soldiers and a rival army. His enemies were ignorance, infection, decay, and the limits of his own flawed knowledge. His work was thankless, disgusting, and, more often than not, completely futile. But in his own way, he was a hero. Not a hero of victory or success, but a hero of sheer stubborn endurance. He was an unsung, vomit-stained hero of medieval misery. As our story comes to a close and you feel the gentle pull of sleep, let us take a moment for a final quiet reflection. Take a deep, calming breath and be profoundly, deeply grateful for the age in which you live. Be grateful for the simple miracle of soap and clean water. Be grateful for surgeons who study anatomy and germ theory, not astrology and the 4 humors. Be thankful for sterile scalpels, for antibiotics, and for the beautiful, dreamless oblivion of modern anesthesia. May your own dreams tonight be peaceful and, above all, sterile. May your worst medical emergency be nothing more than a paper cut, and may your greatest pain be a mild headache, because as we have learned, the alternative, a real medical emergency in the Middle Ages, was a nightmare beyond our darkest imaginings. Medieval surgery, in the final analysis, truly, spectacularly sucked. Thank you for listening to our grim tale, and may your health be as robust and reliable as a 21st century hospital ward. Sleep well.